Oh, there we go.
Yeah, he'd have the solution, don't worry about it. Yeah.
Very good.
He put the coons down the pits, well, that's what... Only trouble is, they'd all be bashing into each other in the dark. I suppose, if he did put the coons down the pits, he could always whitewash their faces first.
Enoch Powell was sacked from the Tory frontbench in 1968, but his controversial views had thrown open the issue of race. Now no politician could ignore the power of the race card. The scale and immediacy of the popular response to Powell's Rivers of Blood speech shook the British political establishment.
88% of Slough people say they support Enoch Powell. 88%.
If you look at it from the point of view of history, Powell's speech was the seminal moment.
It made him the most popular politician in England.
Within 3 days of the speech, MPs faced a spontaneous mass demonstration by Powell's supporters.
Many people in the country rose to Enoch. You remember, the London dockers loved him.
Thousands of dock workers marched on the Houses of Parliament on the day MPs were due to debate a new law on race relations.
They had a slogan, knock, knock, we want Enoch.
Brian and Michael Foot and I and Shelley Williams and a lot of other people were all together watching this.
Michael Foot, the noblest of men, and especially on this issue, couldn't believe that these proletarian Labour voters could possibly hold such horrendous views.
We want Enoch Powell! We want Enoch Powell!
There was a kind of idealisation of the British worker within the intellectual wing of the Labour movement, which saw the British worker as being incapable of intolerance, racism and so forth.
We're not racialists. We told him that this was just a minute snowball that would go down the hill and get larger, larger and larger.
One docker with a bullhorn outside the House of Commons said, "We're very tolerant down at the docks, but when our women are threatened, we stand up." And I remember Michael saying, "What on earth is he talking about?"
Some might have risen to him because they had prejudices, but those prejudices were not there in Enoch Powell.
The most senior Labour and Conservative figures were more irritated than surprised by the high-profile race now had.
They were expressing, in a demonstrative way, disquiet that I knew they had had for a very long time. This was nothing new to me. I wasn't learning anything new from these demonstrations at all.
As far as the dockers were concerned, well, dockers have their views and they march and express them very strongly. But the country isn't governed by dockers. So that didn't change our position in the least.
Pray silence, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, for the Right Honourable J. Enoch Powell.
With over 1,000 non-white immigrants entering the country each week, Powell continued to campaign. Both Labour and the Conservatives distanced themselves from his inflammatory rhetoric, but they were reluctant to alienate his many supporters. Their compromise was to embrace the equation at the core of Powell's argument, but to express it in politically acceptable terms.
The line was, minimise the immigration, then there'll be so few, everyone can be relaxed, and then we can not have discrimination. I mean, that was really the argument.
The smaller the numbers of the strangers who come amongst us, the easier it is to treat them exactly as ourselves.
People have not got confidence that the government have got a grip on the situation as far as fresh immigrants are concerned. Now, this concerns me because I want to see good race relations, and I do not believe you can have good race relations unless people have got confidence that the situation is under control.
If we were to have an open door to them at the end of the day, then it would mean such an influx that our social services, our housing, our whole environment in some of our big towns and cities would be congested and overloaded to the point where it would be impossible to carry out one of the most difficult problems any country's had to do in recent times, and that is to assimilate the immigrants among our own population.
It may have been politically convenient to follow Powell's line that tough immigration control was the key to fostering positive race relations, but there was a risk.
If your immigration restrictions are too repressive, you encourage bad race relations rather than encourage contentment and satisfaction. Because you are saying we can't afford any more of these people here, and the implication is there's something undesirable about these people.
What's the coon doing here?
By the 1970 general election campaign, both parties feared that outright public attacks on Powell could lose them the election. But one member of Wilson's cabinet was unwilling to soft-pedal.
The final proof of Powell's power is that Heath dare not attack him publicly, even when he says things that disgust decent Conservatives.
I decided that the right thing to do was to come out not only again on the main question, but to link it to fascism.
The flag of racialism, which has been hoisted in Wolverhampton, is beginning to look like the one that fluttered 25 years ago over Dachau and Belsen.
Larry Harris put Mr. Benn's attack to him for campaign report.
The most evil feature of Mr. Powell's new conservatism is the hatred it is stirring up.
I'll answer the question very briefly indeed, for part of it was answered by the reaction of the ordinary men and women who heard the reported remarks. But I beg your pardon? Well, I heard it, and people can judge for themselves what the reaction is. And people can judge for themselves what the reaction of the British public is, too.
This issue, because it is so important, not just in this country, but in the world in which we live, has got to be an issue in this election, and we have got to make it so.
Of course, it infuriated Harold Wilson, who didn't want this question on the agenda. He said later that I lost hundreds of seats for Labour, or thousands of votes, I forget what it was.
The Queen has asked me to form the next government, and I am indeed proud to accept.
Many felt that Powell did help the Conservatives to victory.
Well, those are the Powellites. Those are his supporters. There's no evidence of that.
I personally think Enoch was always an asset. Always an asset.
In government, the Conservatives were swift to introduce a new immigration law.
Legislation will be introduced on Commonwealth immigration.
It's a tough act. Here is Edward Heath taking a brave stand against building up racist feeling, xenophobic feeling, but also agreeing to and permitting the 1971 Act.
The new law was designed to make good the Conservatives' tough promises and to put a lid on race as a political issue. It restricted the right to live in the UK to people whose parents or grandparents were British. Very few non-white Commonwealth citizens qualified.
It was, in a real sense, a piece of racist legislation covered up by the grandparental clause, but what it really meant was that if you're white you can come in, and if you're not white you can't.
Well, I mean, only discriminatory if you're saying that people who don't qualify on this basis aren't able to come. That's not discriminating against them as individuals. It's just saying, well, these are the people that we're prepared now to accept.
I am the only black leader who is very tough and very strong in the world today.
Events in Uganda soon put paid to the government's hopes that race could now be kept out of the political spotlight.
The end of exploiters, and no one is going to exploit his brother.
he was a splendid product of the King's African Rifles, and good boxer, good rugby player.
On top of these accomplishments, Idi Amin had become president of Uganda after a military coup.
He went around telling everybody that he had 3 best friends. One was the Queen, our Queen. One was Moshe Dayan, the Israeli Defense Minister. And the other was the British High Commissioner. So, I was in good company.
In 1972, Amin decided on a radical policy towards Uganda's Asian minority, most of whom had British passports.
Last Friday, I announced the decision of my government to ask the British government to take over responsibility for the British citizens of Asian origin living in Uganda.
The Ugandan Asians who'd been brought to Uganda under British colonial rule were to be expelled en masse within 90 days.
By order of the military government, the anti-Asian campaign swung into action last weekend.
The Asians are unwanted. They have done more harm than good.
The Africans were not given a chance. They were frustrated right from the very beginning.
Oh, go down.
I got letter.
Do you feel threatened?
Well, I do. Just in 90 days you cannot do anything.
We had 90 days to leave, and you can imagine the panic. And in fact, I was 10 at the time, and it was just my parents just kind of, dumbstruck. What do you do? I mean, we weren't prepared for this, so there were no savings or anything like that.
Richard Slater found he was no longer one of Amin's best friends.
There were all his ministers standing in a row, and civil servants and soldiers and heaven knows who. But they all were too scared to throw me a kindly word or to appear to know me at all. So I was in the doghouse. And then Amin was busy stuffing himself, and we hardly exchanged a word.
Evening light mellows very softly into its range of warm lemon tones, pressing among the close bunches of the ripening grapes.
Amin's decision also had unpleasant consequences for members of the British government.
I was on holiday in Corfu, and one night we were having our evening meal on looking out over the lovely moonlit sea and a little taverna. I remember having some very nice prawns and whitebait, when I got a message, would I speak to Mr. Heath, the Prime Minister, on the telephone? And his message was he was very sorry, we had got to come home, and he was sending a plane to collect me.
I was playing cricket at Hurlingham, and we were playing the MCC, and we had a good chance of beating them. And I remember coming off the field and being handled by a rather grand flunky with a silver tray, handing it to me. It had a card on it saying, please ring Mr. Robert Carr immediately. So I had the temerity to say, well, actually, we've got the best chance of beating the MCC for the last 10 years, and I'm 50-odd not out. And I will, of course, get back. He said, well, get your priorities right. Beat the MCC and then come back and help me out with this particular problem. And I did.
The far right fueled public hostility to the prospect of another wave of immigration.
We've taken a petition down to the Robert Carr in the Home Office, and we're asking him to have some common sense about this. We have 1 million unemployed. We can't squeeze up anymore.
I was in the Home Office and sent down to the Immigration Department to help cope with just the masses of parliamentary questions and ministerial correspondence and correspondence from the public. We got, during the Ugandan Asian crisis, massive, nasty, vile, racist postbag.
At first, ministers seemed reluctant to displease the opponents of immigration.
I can remember the then minister having himself on the TV.
The government's first priority has been, as a matter of great urgency, to get in touch with over 20 governments all over the world who might assist.
Promising them that they wouldn't all come there. They'd arranged for Canada to take some from them and everything, as if they were some sort of, frightful disease.
I'm sure that new homes can be found for many of these Asians throughout the world.
I think this whole business of saying that other countries were going to help us by taking some of them was very, very bad in the public relations point of view.
These rumours were there that, you know, Britain's not interested in taking us, and India said categorically it didn't want to know because it didn't see us as Indians, that we were British, and so there was a real problem and a real panic.
Less than half of the Ugandan Asians were offered homes by other countries. The government finally took the decision to admit the remainder, nearly 30,000 people.
Just to show that you are a resident of UK.
At the height of the crisis, the decision was debated at the Conservative conference in Blackpool.
Enoch Powell came to the conference and moved a motion effectively condemning the government for its policies.
When the East African countries became independent, there was no suggestion, let alone undertaking, in Parliament or outside, that those inhabitants who remained citizens of the United Kingdom and colonies would have right of entry into this country.
All the great party managers would be, I knew what they'd be up to, they'd be trying to suggest to the leader of the party that we should have a fudge. When I talked to Ted, he said, of course we're taking it on, we'll go in and bat, and we did.
I must make clear that I utterly reject Mr. Powell's criticisms of our policies and intentions. We put a great deal into our empire, and we also took a lot out. We have our imperial heritage and our obligations, and to those we will stick. That is why I ask you today with confidence to support your government by giving us an overwhelming majority for this resolution as amended.
I didn't know I could shout as well as that. But however, it was quite a dramatic debate, which we won by a very substantial majority.
I think Robert Carr is a remarkable man. He's been underestimated. It took a lot of courage to do what he did.
Once the decision had been made, there was a rapidly organised programme of airlifts from Uganda. Many in Britain welcomed the new arrivals.
A notice was given out in church by the vicar saying that people were going to come, and anybody who could help and give assistance of any kind, please would they go out and do so.
And then landed at Stansted. And I'll tell you something, I have never been so cold in my life.
They had arrived in very thin clothes, and they were really very chilly.
You knew it was going to be cold, and you'd read about snow and things like that, but this was cold, and this is October, this is early October.
What a lovely baby, is it a boy or a girl?
A girl.
Oh, look at that.
It was a wonderful opportunity to get a bit of space in my wardrobe and feel that it was going to help somebody. I just went home and got coats and jackets and things of that nature and took them out.
I remember being ushered into this building, or I guess the terminal building, and it was like Aladdin's cave, full of clothes.
Unless do you want someone to clothes, you might want someone to clothes. We'd better go to the clothing place next, I think.
And it was wonderful. You just had layers on layer after layer after layer, and it was great. I remember that. And, you know, having a great big coat on at the end of it all, so you got 10 layers and a great big coat on top, and you felt like a king.
One young couple in South London opened their doors to a family of Ugandan Asians.
We lived in Lambeth with a young family, and we passionately believed in good community relations at a time when it was far from easy.
My father very kindly gave up the spare room he had in our house. He was a civil servant working in Whitehall and was content to be displaced.
I think Eleanor Roosevelt's great phrase that it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness. If you care about things, do something.
But this sort of welcome was rare. Though the political establishment had stood up to the far right, the episode had revived public hostility towards immigrants. Tensions were most acute in areas like Leicester, where many of them had settled.
They're coming over thick and fast now, and I'd like to think that they're going to put a halt to it shortly.
Well, I think it's about time the government took over its responsibilities and sent these people back to their country of origin.
I think our friend Enoch's got the right idea there, and the National Front.
The attempt to sideline race as a political issue had failed. To the horror of the main parties, the National Front grew rapidly and became a highly visible political force.
And what are the leaders of Britain doing today? They've opened the floodgates of our country to an invasion even more foreign than that might have threatened us in 1914 or 1940. Immigration! No! Repatriation! Yes! How's Britain's...
After 1972, National Front membership tripled in only 2 years. By the mid-1970s, far-right candidates were winning up to a third of the vote in some local elections.
It was a kind of poison that surrounded us. It affected everybody. Everybody felt you had to kind of almost be on one side or the other, and there were kind of, as people got drunk in pubs at night, you know, these arguments would come to the fore and get quite nasty. That was the time of the National Front having all these provocative marches.
Up your arse, that's where it is. Get back to Moscow.
We'll probably move it up the pole a little bit when we come to walk, but that's about it. So the flag won't be too long, and I'll have it behind me a bit, I expect. And that grips quite well with the elastic bands now.
We're gonna send the flags back. We're gonna send the flags back.
What a lovely day we're going to have. What a lovely day with our racialistic slogans.
The BNP used to come to my meetings and try to break them up and shout me down and all the rest of it, and presented a fairly kind of intimidating face. And then they announced they were going to hold a march, which of course was going to be through the very middle of the immigrant settlement in Hitchin. We decided to invite the people of goodwill to simply line the route of the march with their backs turned to the march. It was marvellous because the impact was simply deadened all the way through, yet the immigrant community knew that they had English people who were willing to associate and identify with them.
The far right sought to capitalise on specific local tensions.
We were fostering for Westminster, Haringey and Hertfordshire, and many more black children were in care than white, so we were getting about 70% of black children.
These are the two you've got.
Yes. Ah, darling. Oh, yes, they're lovely. But they have their moments.
You know, you're going to get some right funny looks when you take them through the town, because you're not a match for colour, are you?
Mr. Tatlock. Mind you, he could be right. You know some folk.
I think I'm quite capable of dealing with that.
Yeah, but you haven't tried it yet, have you?
Having been here a few months and had a few coloured children in, I had one coloured child who went to play out on his bike in the road because the garden wasn't paved. And then that's when we had an objectionable phone call from a neighbour saying, if you don't want your foster child killed, you better bring him in. And then she got up a petition around the neighbours saying that the house properties would drop if we had coloured people in the road.
The Watsons also received hate mail.
Don't take these kids in, because you will have to see us. These kids have been sent here for one thing, to take our jobs over. We, the white people, say halt before it is too late, albeit on your own head. You are being watched.
Then the National Front saw it in the local paper, and so they put a leaflet round all the neighbours, invited them to a public meeting against the Watsons having a coloured ghetto in Oakroyd Avenue.
The campaign against them obliged the Watsons to fight a 3-year legal battle simply to preserve their right to foster black children as well as white.
Come on, Vernon, we'll all go for one. Piggyback. We go. One big happy family, all right?
Well, sort of average family anyway.
Meanwhile, the political pressure for change was growing, fuelled by less overt but more widespread discrimination.
I rang up about a job, secretarial work. The woman was... We had a good conversation. We started talking about life in general. She said, come along, come along. I went there. I was spoke to her secretary as soon as I got in. I went into the office. She said, "Who are you?" I said, "I was just speaking to you on the phone half an hour
But you didn't sound like a wog on the telephone,
No.
presumably. Yeah.
She looked at me and she said, "I'm very sorry. The job is gone."
Labour's incoming Home Secretary was Roy Jenkins, who'd made some progress on race relations in his previous spell in the job. Jenkins travelled to the United States to learn from the American experience of trying to tackle problems faced by minorities through legislation. He was accompanied by the man he'd picked to draft a new law.
We organised a seminar for him in Philadelphia, and the Home Secretary sat there with me, learning from American experience. I suddenly realised I'd cocked it up in the white paper, and on the plane back again, had to say to him, "I'm afraid we're going to have to go to Cabinet to reverse an idiocy I put into the white paper about the concept of discrimination." I, with all my expertise, had failed to grasp the fact, which we learnt in America, that you can't have a definition of discrimination which deals only with overt, direct, intentional discrimination.
The Act was rewritten to outlaw any practice which had the effect of disadvantaging black and Asian people. It also strengthened the law on discrimination in the workplace, schools and housing.
They was happy and content to do that until your bloody Labour lot started bunging their ideas in their head, daft bloody ideas, and unsettling them all.
Ideas of human dignity.
Ideas above their bloody station.
And equality.
Look, you start giving them a bit of equality, next thing you know, they're bloody well demanding it.
The new law was not universally welcomed.
The communist government that you've got in at the moment prevents us from free speech.
The word nigger means a person of a black face, and I will always call that person of a black face a nigger!
But Jenkins' new Race Relations Act contained a major flaw. Just like the previous act in 1968, it didn't apply to police law enforcement. This omission would be seen as critical by the Stephen Lawrence inquiry more than 2 decades later.
I think almost everybody would now agree it was wrong. What I find rather more difficult to explain, I know how the sequence of events in 68, and I tried to think about them in 76. I don't honestly know, and I suppose I'm to some extent to blame for this.
It's an example of a complete unwillingness to recognise that it was possible for the police or for the courts to act in a way that was institutionally racist.
The Labour government dragged its feet on the piece of legislation that led most frequently to accusations of police racism.
That is Section 4 of the 1824 Vagrancy and Street Offences Act, more commonly known as loitering with intent or simply sus.
I was walking out of British Home Stores. When I came out, there's a guy waiting outside the door, and he says, "Come over here, you." I just said I was just doing some shopping, but I didn't see anything I liked. So he asked me where I was working. I told him I was working in Regent Street. And he says, "All right," he says, "I'm nicking you." I says, "What for?" He says, "I'm nicking you for stuff." I says, "I ain't done," I says, "You've got to be joking." I said, "I ain't done anything." He says, "I'm nicking you." So he took me to a back room in British Home Stores, locked me up there. Then he phoned for a police car. About 10 minutes later, a police car came, put me in the back, and took me to the police station.
Black and Asian young people were vulnerable to arrest under sus. In 1977, a group of parents in South London decided that was unacceptable.
Mavis, how does this police harassment of young people affect their parents?
I think it's got tremendous effect on the people living here in Lewisham because they're disturbed, they're worried. Every time the children goes out, there's always this concern about whether or not they've been picked up. So I used to go down to the police station and say, "Come on, I demand that you let these kids out. I want to take them home," because by then the parents were so debilitated by the whole thing that they couldn't do anything.
Mavis Best became the spearhead of a national campaign to scrap sus, helped by a future Home Office minister.
I think the act and the sense that they are being persecuted and picked on has very much embittered relationships between the police and young blacks. The great strength of the Scrap Sus campaign was that it came from the grassroots experience of a group of black women in Lewisham and came in time to embrace black people, white people, churches, political parties, all united in the belief that this was a law that had to change.
We went to see Merlin Reeves and to discuss what the Labour Party could do.
But Roy Jenkins' successor as Home Secretary had to consider other points of view.
I remember talking to the Commissioner of Police of the Metropolis about it. Now, you didn't have great formal meetings, but we used to meet once a month and over a cup of coffee in the evening and chat about things.
Is society really saying that if we know that there's a man at that corner who has a murderous weapon in his pocket and he may use it, that we shouldn't have the right to search him before he probably commits a murder?
David McNee felt strongly that without the power to stop and search, his men wouldn't be able to do their job properly.
That was the assumption that I came away with, that he wasn't certain that the British people were ready for the Labour to take on issues like that.
The Home Office consistently, under both Labour and Conservative Home Secretaries, refused to accept that the Sus law was either inherently discriminatory or being used in a discriminatory way.
It took the newly created Select Committee of backbench MPs to bring about change.
We went along and put the case to them, and John Wheeler was the chair of it. Very handsome man he was at the time.
I wonder if she would say the same today.
I thought, you know, it was pretty striking and very, very supportive.
I was immediately impressed by the quality of the evidence that came from the various interests.
Wheeler's committee had to use strong-arm tactics to force reforms.
I encouraged the committee to come to the conclusion that it did and to carry the case forward within the Home Office and within government to see that the legislation eventually came forward to amend the law. It was very controversial at the time. I don't think I was always very popular.
It took us 3 years to convince politicians the need to repeal the Act. So the credit must go to the black community for this. And no one else.
But in the end, it was anxiety over new arrivals that still provoked the most political turmoil.
It is this fact, which added to all the rest, points to the prospect of eventual conflict upon a scale which cannot adequately be described by any lesser term than civil war.
By the mid-70s, the battleground had switched to family members who wanted to join black and Asian people already settled in Britain. Some 50,000 were still arriving each year.
There were still a lot of men who'd come to Britain to work, recruited, and whose families were still stuck in India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. And what had happened as sort of racist atmosphere had grown up in the country and allegations of, you know, people coming in wrongly, more and more hurdles and checks had been put into the system, and it became an entrapping system that really put families through hell to prove that they really were the children and the wife of the man.
There were enough people trying to get in when they shouldn't get in to cause the inquiries to be more and more tough, more and more prolonged, more and more suspicious, and the innocent suffer from that, even when the wicked ones somehow have a cleverness to get through.
Many of the people waiting here will have travelled hundreds of miles, not for an interview, but merely to get a date for a first interview. The earliest dates now available are 21 months away. August 24th, 1976, nearly 2 years before this woman can even begin to prove her claim.
But getting an interview was only the first hurdle. Panorama filmed an office in Pakistan where half the applicants failed to convince officials of their case.
I cannot really be satisfied in my own mind, I stress the word satisfied, that you are related as claimed to Mohammed Afsar in the United Kingdom. You've been unable to offer any explanation at all for the occurrence of these discrepancies. And I'm obliged, therefore, to refuse your applications to join Mohammed Afsar in the United Kingdom. This is my decision. You may appeal against my decision.
She can appeal to an adjudicator in England, but that may take years.
The minister in charge of immigration under Roy Jenkins was uneasy about the way the system operated.
Alex Lyon is the Home Office Minister in charge of all immigration policy. Mr. Lyon, are you satisfied yourself with the procedures that we've seen in this film?
No, I'm not. I've never been satisfied with it since I took over in March.
Is it at all necessary for most of these apparently bona fide cases to go through all this?
We have to distinguish between that which is necessary to put off the evader and that which simply deters the bona fide applicant. These people have a legal right to come, and there are a limited number of them. I have no hesitation in saying that the sooner that they can come, the better for everybody concerned.
Alex Lyon, who died in 1993, used his ministerial powers to help applicants he thought genuine to beat the system. He was assisted at the Home Office by his future wife.
We had to work very long hours to get all these cases processed. We used to have piles and piles of files, massive, massive caseload. And he used to go through them one by one and use his discretion to overrule the advice of the department to get families reunified.
What he liked to do was to have a little bit of freedom of manoeuvre on his own, to be helpful. Helpful is not the right word, to give people what they wanted at his discretion.
I used to get my assistant private secretary to put them into piles of no and yes, because the yes ones he could sign without looking at them, so he had enough time to crawl through the other ones to sort of overturn.
He liked to be able to say yes, because he'd like to be nice to people, which not always possible. They can't always have what they want. In life, I must say, if I can be a bit sort of philosophical.
It made a lot of difference to a lot of families. I still meet people around Britain on railway stations and things who say, I remember your former husband, he was the one who let our family be together again.
Alex Lyon was sacked after only 2 years in the job.
He was quite clumsy about the way that he went about pursuing his aims inside the Home Office. He greatly offended many officials, though not his private secretary, Claire Short. I'm afraid that he and Roy Jenkins didn't get on very well.
Alex interpreted it as a lack of support for his firm convictions on race and immigration, and he felt that deeply, and he said so.
Couldn't it be that Mr. Callaghan, with his generally acknowledged keen sense of public opinion, recognises that ultra-liberal attitudes on race relations cause a good deal of popular resentment?
I like the delicate way you put it, and I think that that is a very important factor in his mind, and an out-of-date factor.
Lyon's departure removed from government one of the few opponents of tough immigration controls.
By the time I was Home Secretary, the question of illegal immigrants, people coming in vehicles to the ports and coming in, was a major issue. You'd think that every night half of Pakistan or Asia was padding up the beaches of Dover, the way everybody believed it was going on. It did go on to some degree.
Far from fostering good race relations in Britain, the drive to keep out illegal immigrants often made matters worse.
Why are my children apart from me? Just because of these racist laws.
My recollection of Anwar Dita's campaign was that she came to symbolise a much wider problem.
Rochdale, Lancashire. Anwar Dita lives here with her husband and 4-year-old daughter.
I was born in Birmingham, brought up in Rochdale. I was sent to Pakistan in 1962. I was married in 1968. I had 3 children there. And my husband came to England in 1973. I followed him in 75. And after the birth of my 4th child, that's where all my hell of the life began.
When Anwar tried to bring her first 3 children from Pakistan to join her, the authorities refused them entry. The Home Office became suspicious about a discrepancy in Anwar's story. Anwar had married her husband twice, once under Islamic law in Pakistan, then 7 years later under British law. The first time she'd only been 15 and they'd lied about her age, so Anwar's date of birth was different on the two marriage certificates.
They said there's two Anwar-Ditas. One Shujaudin married in Pakistan, the second one that he married in Rochdale. My answer to that was, I'm the same person.
Anwar's children had to remain in Pakistan for 6 years while she campaigned against the Home Office's refusal to admit them to Britain.
I had to go to give fingerprints and thumbprints.
I gave them photographs, I gave them loads of details what they needed of the children.
Lie detector I offered myself. Blood test I offered myself. I even offered the Home Office that I'll pay for the investigation for somebody to go from the Home Office. All these things weren't accepted.
They are cruel and they're bloody liars, the Home Office. That's what I think of the Home Office.
The more they, said no, the more determined I was to prove that, I'm not a liar. It's the government that is lying.
I'm going to fight till the last breath in my body. I'm not going to give up. I'm going to keep fighting on because they are my children. Nobody in the world can prove that they're not mine.
Bring no more children home! National immigration control! Bring no more children home!
So the last resort was going for internal medical examination to prove that I gave birth to more than one child. And that was the really, really, hard thing for me. That was really bad. It was like, how can I describe it? It was like being abused by consent. That's how I felt. By law, you can do this to me, to prove that these are my children. And I can never forget that, never.
In 1981, the Home Office finally surrendered to the weight of evidence.
The children arrived in Manchester 6 years to the day after they last saw their mother in Pakistan. Their father had flown over specially to collect them. At last, the reunion. Mrs. Dita wept, the children were dazed, and they hardly remembered the mother who'd fought the Home Office for 6 years to bring them to England.
Even when I think about it, what I've been through, you feel so depressed and you say, what the hell? Why did I go through all this? All those questions wouldn't have arisen if I would have been white.
The pressure to check the numbers entering Britain at Heathrow filtered down to immigration officers.
I was once told if I wasn't too sure about how to interpret the rules or I felt unhappy about it, perhaps I should interpret them as this particular chief immigration officer had done, which was to say, well, did I want the particular person standing in front of me, living next to me in 10 years' time?
One test became notorious.
They started examining women to see whether they were virgins or not, on the grounds that no Indian man sending for a woman would accept someone who wasn't a virgin as his potential wife. So therefore, if the woman had lost her virginity, she was phony. She was trying to get in on other grounds. And this actually went on at Heathrow Airport Terminal 3.
The virginity test was one of the things one couldn't quite believe was really happening.
After the scandal of virginity tests became public, the Labour Home Secretary put a halt to it.
Actually, I think it was so gross that it was one of those milestones that started things being improved.
The most extreme features of immigration control, which had so poisoned race relations, seemed to be disappearing. But there was soon a new twist to the politics of immigration.
I now propose to take a turn to the right, which is very appropriate.
Up to this time, both Labour and the Conservatives had resisted the temptation to play the race card to win votes. But in the run-up to the 1979 election, the new Conservative leader had no such qualms.
World in Action asks Conservative leader Margaret Thatcher about immigration, unemployment, pay policy, and about her future relations with Edward Heath and Enoch Powell.
People are really rather afraid that this country might be rather swamped by people with a different culture. And you know, the British character has done so much for democracy, for law, and done so much throughout the world, that if there's any fear that it might be swamped, people are going to react and be rather hostile to those coming in. So if you want good race relations, you've got to allay people's fears on numbers. That's one thing that's driving some people to the National Front. They don't agree with the objectives of the National Front, but they say that at least they're talking about some of the problems. Now, we, the big political parties, if we don't want people to go to extremes, and I don't, we ourselves must talk about this problem, and we must show that we're prepared to deal with it.
Mrs. Thatcher's comments immediately polarised opinion.
I think Mrs. Thatcher's remarks are very much racist.
I think she's perfectly right.
And I do.
She is talking racialist language, and she is making the National Front more respectable in the eyes of the British people.
I normally disagree with everything that Mrs. Thatcher says, but I think this time for a change it does make a bit of sense.
The Shadow Home Secretary appeared to be firmly behind her.
Don't you think perhaps that the use of the word swamped was a little emotive?
The fears are there, and she was saying what those fears were, and she's right. They are there.
Willie Whitelaw was then the Shadow Home Secretary. He'd been building bridges to the immigrant community and so forth, so blew up those bridges and infuriated him. And he certainly at that time, for a few days, very strongly contemplated resigning, which would, of course, have been very grave step to take, because not only was he Shadow Home Secretary, he was Deputy Leader of the party.
In some quarters, Mrs. Thatcher's remarks were even less well received.
I remember going to see the Indian Prime Minister, I think it was in number 10 Downing Street, and I followed Mrs. Thatcher as always, and I was sitting waiting, and she came out of the room and stumped past me without even saying good morning, disappeared out the door, and I went in, and the man was sitting fuming. He was saying, terrible woman, terrible woman. And I said, it could be worse. She could have promised to take back India. So he just laughed, and we got on all right after that.
Many considered that Margaret Thatcher had finally given in to the temptation to play the race card.
Well, you must judge that.
I think the swamping remarks were designed to win votes, probably.
I think swamping was a carefully calculated word intended to make the hair stand up on the back of people's necks and feel that only the Tory party would save us from some sort of black annihilation.
At the election, it wasn't Labour which felt the main impact of Thatcher's repositioning on race.
One group who've done spectacularly badly in this election is the National Front, with a mere 2% of the vote in London. Their poor showing is all the more significant since they'd made their most determined bid for the mass support which has so far eluded them.
The Front put up a record 300 candidates. They all lost their deposits.
I think looking back it was healthy, because there was enough ballast in the Tory party that was not going to be so vilely, crudely racist, that it was better to destroy the National Front. I don't know how good her motives were, but I think historically it was probably helpful.
The acceptance of tough immigration policies had successfully contained the challenge of Enoch Powell and the far right, but it didn't lead to better race relations. 2 years after Margaret Thatcher took power, the frustration of black and Asian Britons erupted into violence.
Playing the Race card returns to BBC Two next Sunday at the earlier time of 7:10.
Our housing, our whole environment in some of our big towns.